I am going to talk to you from the vantage point of a person that's been teaching in business school for 20 plus years. So I can tell you not just where I think we are, but how I believe we got here. And I'll tell you why I wrote this talk. A few months ago, I was on this 6 train. I saw 2 women who didn't know each other meet and hate each other almost instantly. And it was anecdotal, but it occurred to me, we are so divided that we can meet and have contempt in the shortest time possible. And because I fundamentally believe that business drives, causes everything, I wanted to connect the dots. What does enterprise and how it's operating today have to do with how pissed off we are at each other? So let's see if we can connect those dots. Check the box. Start with a cat video. And I came up with a new title, Getting Clobbered. Bigger isn't always better was getting me in trouble. But the big are getting bigger. So here's a bit of data. In 1978, the 100 largest publicly traded firms earned 48% of all the income earned by all publicly traded companies. That number was 52.8% in 95, and it is now over 85%. 85% of all income earned is earned by the 100 companies. Not exactly true, in fact. Today, there's half as many publicly traded firms as there were not too long ago. So we have under 4,000. 20 years ago, we had greater than 8,000. And maybe a more pointed way to put it is 28 firms earn half the income earned by the entire S&P 500. So it is fair to say we have more wealth concentrated in fewer firms than ever before. And so that's something unprecedented, where we can say, can we learn from history? It's hard when something is unusual. So the top 4 companies, and wanting to diversify away from just talking about the Google, Amazon, Facebook issues. E-commerce, 58% of share is for firms. In hotels, 77% of hotel share is for firms. Airlines, 70%. Do you know that hopeless feeling? I fly a lot. When something goes wrong and you look at the gate agent and you just think, I have no hope. Pharma, 62%, and quick service restaurants, 44% of share is just 2 companies, McDonald's and Starbucks. Some industries don't even have 4 players. I couldn't list 4, and you know who they are, right? Who are the 4 players in Google space, or in Facebook space, or in Amazon regarding ebooks? And I'm not cherry picking here, because there's academic papers that look at all industries, and here's a summary. 75% of all US industries became more concentrated over the past 2 decades, meaning there's really no industry that isn't kind of paying some sort of cost for what's changed. What's changed that's caused all of this concentration? Firms and industries with the largest increase in concentration have, and here's what's really important to us. And again, what we're trying to explain is how we feel. Okay, so what's relevant to us? There are higher profit margins. These firms are making more profit on every unit they sell. So profit margins are up. They're enjoying positive and so-called abnormal stock returns. And their M&A deals actually make money. There's a whole bunch of course notes people who teach strategy had to throw away. The ones that talked about deals mostly destroying value. It's just not really true in recent history. Market power, right, this thing we call market power, the thing we're supposed to be somewhat shielded from by antitrust laws, et cetera, is becoming a very important source of enterprise value. So this isn't enterprise value created just by innovation, just by creativity. It's also being created by the fact that there's a unprecedented insulation from competition in today's environment. So this stunning increase in concentration can be linked to how we feel economically, but also socially and also philosophically. And although corporate profits are high, right, this is a very weird coincidence of feelings. Corporations are generating more wealth than ever before, and simultaneously, half of all undergraduates think socialism is a better form of economic organization than capitalism. So, don't have to look far to find evidence of the volume of corporate profits. So Harvard Business Review stated that corporate profits were at an all-time high, but we need to look at the array of corporate profits. And this array of corporate profits, I'm going to show you there's many analogies to this. In corporate profits, what we see in corporate profits, we see in other arrays, like earnings of actors, et cetera. So we'll talk about that in a second. But in addition to the level of profits, what's really different today is the distribution of profits. In the mid-1990s, around 5% of firms had a return on invested capital. That's kind of like a standard measure of robustness in business school. It's the ratio of income to the amount you invest to earn that income. And in the 1990s, 5% of firms had income over the amount they invested to earn that income of 50%, which is, by the way, an extraordinary number. In 2016, this percent increased to 10%. So that sounds good. So now 10% of firms have a ratio of income to invested capital of over 50%. Amazing. It's the bottom 85% of companies that, for me, ring alarm bells. The bottom 85% of the distribution has taken a step down. So it's this gap between the top and the middle that's just enormous. And I want to kind of draw out a few reasons why this gap has increased. And this gap between the middle firm and the top firm, the gap between the middle earner and the top earner, the gap between the average person who's a member of SAG and Leonardo DiCaprio, that's what we want to talk about. So I remember this slide. I used this slide in like the first year I taught, only I had to change the heading. So I could show using data, when I first started teaching in 1994, I could show using data that as corporate profits went up, there was a huge net positive effect on the entire ecosystem, meaning all stakeholders on net went up, and usually every stakeholder benefited. So the net was all good. If corporate profits went up, it floated on net all boats, and often it floated every boat. And so I use that to be really somewhat dismissive about thinking about, corporate social responsibility. It's responsible to just make profits, and then everyone's boat gets floated. It's all good. Anyway, I'm going to blame the 80s. I hope you have something against the 80s, too. But in the 80s, that's when we really ushered in this absolute capital-centric way of thinking. And it took a long time for it to take full root. And it took, I think, until relatively recently for us to kind of see the effects. So capital was relatively uncompensated. You're young and spry. I can see by looking at you. So I'm glad we're bringing up the past here. capital was shockingly uncompensated, like in the 60s and 70s. They were an aside. Economists, for instance, we had Adam Smith, and then we didn't have anybody talk about how capital got treated really shitty until the 70s, maybe like the 60s and the 70s. Nobody really thought about it. There were these managers, and they ran companies that were enormous, and they didn't own the company. This separation of ownership and control is like a really big deal, and it was kind of ignored. At some point, Wall Street noticed that capital was kind of getting the worst slice. So there was enterprise. It was like the only source of prosperity. I'm giving you the money so that you can make this enterprise happen. And yet me, the provider of capital, is kind of doing relatively bad. So this was kind of like the tip of the iceberg. Does anyone know who this guy is? Oh, good. Raise your hand if you know. Okay, good. This is what I'm talking about, right? I'm so glad to have this retro view. This is Ross Johnson. He was the CEO of RJR Nabisco, and he became the poster. Oh, you thought I meant, is this James Gardner? No, no, it's James Gardner playing Ross Johnson. So Ross Johnson became the poster guy. Poor thing in a way, because he was one of many. So he was the poster guy for corporate excess. And this is what got Wall Street all in a tizzy. Anyway, watch.
Did you see the hatchet job in Business Week? RJR low stock price, tobacco company declining performance, executive extravagance. I love this. CEO F. Ross Johnson routinely presses $50 bills into the hands of wine stewards.
I saw that.
$50 bills. Jeez, it's been years since I tipped that little.
Hey, you let them bitch all they want about the stock, Ross. Wait till premieres hit the market.
Yeah, where are we on the test results?
Oh, week. 10 days the latest. They're gonna be great, trust me.
They damn well better be.
So let's see how the premiere plays out. Ross, like, personally endorsed this project at RJR. He spent $1.2 billion in 2017 dollars, and this about sums
Bottom line?
Well, of all the groups we tested, the response to Premier was just about uniform.
Mm-hmm.
They all said they tasted like shit.
Like shit?
Shit was the consensus, yes, sir.
They all said that? Nobody liked them?
Fewer than 5%.
We haven't even talked about the smell.
Well, what'd they say that was like? A fart?
Yep.
Oh, you're not serious. They really said that?
We've got an awful lot of fart figures, sir, yes.
Tastes like shit and smells like a fart.
They just need a few adjustments.
Almighty Ed, I don't have to tell you what's writing on these goddamn things. And what the hell's wrong with the draw? You need an extra set of lungs just to take a drag.
So this was kind of the kind of a low point for capital, and then capital got its act together. Investors and academics pointed out that if you levered up companies, if you infused them with a lot of debt, it made management pay attention to earnings. Between 82 and 89, 57% of all large US firms were restructured. That's stunning. So much restructuring in such a short period of time. They were either takeover targets or they restructured on their own. These deals were called LBOs. And LBO boards, these were people with a lot of skin in the game, actually sat on the boards now. And LBOs gave managers equity stakes. So all of this would ultimately culminate in a lot of game changing, a lot of operating companies very, very differently. So business school professors were all really, really happy. They thought this was all good. Steve Kaplan of Booth is one of many great proponents of this type of restructuring. And he could show you how much enterprise value was created simply by giving capital more say in how capital was deployed. debt-disciplined managers who previously ignored shareholders. Firms reversed all these ill-advised diversifications. They eliminated excess capacity. All good, all value creating. In addition to restructurings, you had two things. One is the business press actually started writing articles about bad management. And you had equity-based compensation. That became the norm. 15% of CEO pay was equity-based in '75, raised to 45% by 1995, and then 65% of CEO pay was equity-based compensation by 2015. Now armed with equity and also managed by capital, globalization and investing in new technology makes eminent sense. So what's going to change, what's going to be real now is that economies of scale, the returns to being bigger, are going to be exploited extensively. So to pursue the promise of globalization and new technology, we need big fixed investments in IT, automation. We need scale to spread the costs. Regulation. So I would love to take a poll, but I don't want to take time. But I will tell you about some corporate ed I did last year. I went to a firm that is an online trading platform. And we were talking about what things were a share of revenues. And so I asked, like, typically, what share of revenues is your marketing? What share of revenues is labor? And I asked my usual questions, and they said, you left out one of the biggest share of revenues. What could that be? And they said, regulation. We spend 21% of our revenues on regulatory compliance. That was stunning to me. 21% of revenues. And they told me the very good news was, if they were able to make some of the acquisitions they planned, they could get it to be below 17% as a share of revenues. So acquisitions as a path to amortize regulatory compliance, that's not necessarily value-creating reasons for economies of scale, but quite possibly globalization and new technology is value-creating. I'm not so sure I love the idea of regulations being the reason we grow. So what do we got? Beyond scale economies, we know there's some suspects, we've talked about them enough today, that exhibit these true sort of like new economy attributes. Increasing returns are like economies of scale on steroids, because as your share grows, the product gets better and your cost gets lower, and it becomes rather impossible to compete with you. So that's Google. Google is simply better because it's bigger. So just to recap where we are so far. We have wealth concentrated in very few firms. We have wealth concentrated in very few firms for some very good reasons. One is that IT and globalization are very generous to capital. They deliver very high return on investment. And since capital has a seat at the table, thanks to the restructuring of the 80s, capital says, go, both guns blazing, pedal to the metal, globalize, invest in new technology. It makes firms bigger. It also makes firms more efficient. It also makes firms less in direct competition with other firms. They're able to raise their profit margins. This is all excellent for capital. And then simultaneously, we do have new economy firms. These are firms where size makes the product better, and size also makes the cost lower. So we have economies of scale, and we also have these so-called network effects. Network effects, however, are deepened through economies of scope. Said another way, economies of scope are deepened through network effects. We kind of get both. So just to use the same guys, this is only a partial list of the businesses they're in. This is insane that we could do this easily. So let me just talk about acting for a minute. There's like 125,000 members of SAG, the Screen Actors Guild, 125,000 members. And the average member has an income, or the average of the group is supposedly $52,000 a year. So the average income in SAG is $52,000 a year. Only there's a problem. Almost nobody in SAG makes $52,000 a year. That is a completely vacant spot in the earnings distribution. There are a zillion actors that make less than 1,000, and then a handful of actors, like Leonardo, who I don't know why I'm picking on the poor guy today, but 77 million seems a little detached from the amount of value created for society, but it's very correlated. It's very correlated with the amount of value he creates for the corporations that monetize his content. And these corporations are also the same entities that are like in all of these businesses. So let's stop for a minute and figure out what's going on. So last year, during the primetime hour, you had about 1,400 television shows to choose from. Is that crazy? So on the one hand, there is a proliferation of choice, and there is a proliferation of content. And there isn't, just only 100 companies. There's zillions of attempts happening. But what's happening is, with those 1,400 attempts, the hit rate is lower than ever, and that's creating risk aversion. And that means we're using all the information, all the data that's being generated by these companies. We're using all that information to keep telling us that we should just put Robin Wright in our next show, or Leonardo DiCaprio. Or every time you turn something on, you're like, that's the guy that's also in, right? And you see the same guy in 4 different shows. It's like we're getting to this point where we proliferate, but earnings are so concentrated. And this is really the problem associated with what's happened. So the blue line is the increase in productivity of the small percent of firms at the top. And the gray line is everyone else. The blue line is one woman on the 6 train, and the gray line is the other. This data tells me this. Economies of scale and economies of scope do make firms produce income much more efficiently and also make the products better. The product is better because it's culling information from data. I'm not having to take as many chances in what I buy and what I try. You're able to spread fixed costs really, really effectively when you have really, really high share. But it's creating this tremendous bifurcation between the middle and the top. Globalization also, weirdly and oddly, coincided with greatly reduced antitrust enforcement. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of taste on this. There's a lot of data on this, but here's the thing, the way I'd put it. We have globalized and become incredibly more tribal as a result of globalizing. So let me make that clear. So US antitrust agencies pursued an average of 16 cases a year between 1970 and 1999. In 2014, they tried to pursue 3, but they didn't have the energy. That was between 2000 and 2014 per year. And in the year 2014, they pursued 0. Additionally, the completion rates for M&A transactions have been increasing over time, and antitrust regulators in the US and Europe are now less likely to block mergers than ever before in history. So why is this? And the reason is, if you're a country and you have a global winner in your boundaries, you win. So as a US antitrust enforcer, the last thing I want to do is stymie Google's global possibilities. If I'm an EU antitrust enforcement agency, the last thing I want to do is stymie AB InBev's global possibilities. So as each of these antitrust authorities is sensitive to the value to their own country of having a global winner, they've also simultaneously, so they've enriched or increased the prospects for wealth nationally, but if you look inside of these countries, they have fewer competitors than ever before. See the contrast? So we can win globally, but within the US boundaries, we have people who are literally feeling more have or have not than ever before. And there's no real way to have their back without reducing our global prospects. The blue line is wages and salaries as a share of GDP. The orange line is corporate profits as a share of GDP. So this is the punchline. We give capital a seat at the table because it's true, Ross Johnson was blowing through all of their money, making cigarettes that tasted like shit and smelled like a fart. That was not right. That said, capital took a seat and said, we're not going to let you waste our money anymore. They made sure projects had a return on investment, and look, it did, right? Capital is doing better. But when capital does better, the other constituents potentially don't all have their boat floated. Another point, 2 decades ago, the wage gap in the US was primarily because there was a gap between people within firms. So like the gap between the CEO and somebody working a more line job. Today, the gap is contributed to more by the differences in wages between firms. That's something, right? So, you know, there was a time when you could say, this is about what an account manager makes. Now, when you make that assumption, it's possible you have no idea how big the gap in the same job description is among a very small set of firms. So we've got kind of 2 things driving a very serious wage gap. The within firm issue, but also the across firm issue. And so going back a slide or 2, it's this, right? This matters so much. We never saw this before. So here's a little anecdote that just pisses me off. I thought I'd share it with you. In 2014, Apple and Google settled a massive, I was going to put in parens, 64,000 people were part of this suit. A massive lawsuit involving allegations that they conspired to keep wages in Silicon Valley low by agreeing not to poach each other's workers. Unsealed documents reveal that Steve Jobs once emailed Eric Schmidt after a Google recruiter approached an Apple employee. Schmidt summarily had the recruiter fired and directed the individual's manager to make a public example of his termination and inform Jobs. The late CEO forwarded Schmidt's email internally with a smiley face. So I do understand they're competing in each other's product markets, but I think it's clear they also have conversations that ultimately lead to us being aggravated with each other, and maybe not directing that aggravation at the right source. So what did I expect you to do with this slide? I guess just look at the firms, and I didn't update it recently enough, but because it's the top few have moved up even more. But 10 years ago, if I put this slide up, you would take this sort of like graceful downward slope in market values. You wouldn't go down a few rungs and then fall off a cliff, which is what you see now. So any which way you look at it, there's this gap. So let me summarize what I teach in strategy, and let me tell you why I slightly apologize for it in hindsight. What I would always say in my strategy course was, firms have painful growth in the beginning, and if they organize correctly and make all the right choices, they have a beautiful growth spurt in the middle. And then as they reach maturity, it gets painful again. And the key to enterprise value is what I call scarcity. Selling a product that is rare in how satisfying it is relative to your competitors and substitutes. So it's having a rare customer experience relative to the alternatives. You must have scarcity. And if you have scalability, then you're a wow factor firm. That's a wow if you're scalable, meaning you can grow your share and lower your cost, or grow your share and keep your cost constant. Wow, that is really going to contribute to enterprise value. Your product is rare, your production process is scalable, and then the holy smokes part is added by, what if you're scopable? What if you could add lines of business and you had like the Midas touch? Every business you added to a portfolio of businesses added value to every other business and the reverse. This is why content is primarily produced by only 6 media companies, because they have this scale and scope to withstand the enormous failure rate of cultural content. And when they do have a home run, they can monetize the hell out of it through all of this scale and scope. So I advocated, I begged for these 3 things: scarcity, scalability, and scopeability. And we've gotten that in spades. And where has it gotten us? Well, the 80s, in addition to having some questionable fashion choices, brought us a new form of corporate governance that gave capital too much of a seat at the table. Capital centricity did create wealth. We see it, right? The numbers are really high. But it definitively shifted bargaining power away from employees and away from customers. Business and social justice are inextricable. Scale and scope is definitively a double-edged sword. It's awesome. I can't say enough good about it. I can't also be scared enough about it. Here's when, that ecosystem I showed you of customers and capital and stakeholders generally. When firms actually compete, it does float everybody's boat. It turns out, don't hate capitalism, hate the absence of direct competition. Direct competition is really a tremendously valuable force. The reason corporate earnings are more concentrated than ever is changes in the nature of firms, but some of the reason is regulation, and that's just a big yuck of a reason. And some of the reason is less antitrust enforcement, significantly less. So I'm going to remember somebody I think has a lot of good things to say, and I don't hear him quoted enough these days. This is just good stuff. He said, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have commerce. He actually said wealth, but commerce concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. So, on net, I think I have good news. The good news is that there is truly new ways to create more with less. I do think as this technology takes over more and more of what we do, there is a tremendous displacement of people, but I do think that what history shows us about that is people always get reincorporated doing jobs we can't imagine will exist. Like 100 years ago, if you had predicted to your mother that your great-grandchildren would be writing video games, that wouldn't have made very much sense. So those jobs are in the pipeline. But to get there, I think we have to run our companies differently, and I think we have to run our lives with a lot more awareness about the big forces. Thank you so much. Now wait, don't run.